Hello, my name's Dr Anne Raynor and I'm talking tonight about SEN and all things around compliance and what you will need to have in place if you have an Ofsted inspection or any kind of inspection really. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself is that I've many years experience both as a SENco, head of a special school for pupils with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, and also an inspector. And my role as an inspector is to look at compliance and look and make sure that everything is in place that needs to be in place when you are when you're working. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go through just hold on one second. I'm going to go through what the expectations of an inspection would be. And I know I have a lot of questions asked of me about what people need to put in place. And it is a really complex issue. SEN is a complex issue. We all know that. It's really absolutely about ensuring that we fulfil our legal requirements, more so than in any other area of education, I think, because we have our 2015 Code of Practice that we have to abide by. We also have the Equality Act of 2010. Again, it's really important that we work in a way that is compliant, that we take into consideration what's needed. Because if we don't, then we will be classed as non-compliant both by Ofsted and also by the local authority and anybody else that we're working with. So we need to be really, really tight on how we present our work as a SENco. I think to a certain extent it is so complex, and that many of us as SENcos, you know, we're not quite sure how best to ensure that we have everything in place that needs to be in place. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm just going to talk through what the expectations are when we go through an inspection. So in order to be compliant and to ensure that our SEN provision is in place and is ready for Ofsted, we need to look at 4 different aspects. We need to be looking at 1, the effectiveness of leadership and management, and that's the effectiveness of leadership and management in SEN. Okay, so it's not just your head teacher, it's not just your senior leadership team, but it's also how you are leading your department. It might be a department of 1, you may be your department. It could be that you have lots of TAs, LSAs working with you. It depends. All SEN departments are different. It could be that you're just a SENco. It could be that you're head of learning support. Whatever it is, you need to make sure that you're compliant. So you need to think about the effectiveness of your leadership and management. The second area that we're going to be looking at as an inspector is the quality of teaching, learning and assessment. Okay, now, you may not be part of this, you may not be the head teacher, you may not be going around doing lesson observations. However, I think as a SENco you're in a really, really special position in many ways, because you have the opportunity to go into class, to see what's happening, not to be looking at the teaching necessarily, but just to be supporting there, being a supportive role in terms of what's going on for that child. So we've got effectiveness of leadership and management, we've got quality of teaching, learning and assessment, and then we've got the personal development, the behaviour and the welfare of children. Okay, I think in terms of our SEN students, this is really important, and we need to ensure that when we are presenting evidence And as part of our normal provision, because it isn't all about Ofsted, it isn't all about being compliant, it's about the experience of our pupils. So we need to ensure that in terms of their personal development, in terms of their behaviour, in terms of their welfare, that we need to ensure that they have equal access to anything that's going on, whether it's trips, whether it's sports, whether it's clubs, whatever it is, that our SEN pupils have equal access. And the final one, which is the one that we always hear about, and that's about our outcomes for students, our outcomes for the children. So irrespective of where they start, their starting point, we need to make sure that those children on our list, on our register, are making progress. That's what it's all about. That's what the inspectors want to see. They want to see progress. It doesn't matter whether they're starting at P levels. It doesn't matter where they're starting. They could be pre-entry level in Key Stage 4. They could be wherever they are. We need to make sure that every child is making progress. And you know yourself when you get a young child coming in from foundation stage, you know what it is, what the milestones are. You know what the expectations are, and you know when a child isn't reaching those milestones. So it's about making sure that we put the provision in place in order to make sure that those outcomes are reached. So, as an Ofsted inspector, when we're looking at those 4 areas, we need to think about the effectiveness of leadership and management, the quality of teaching, learning and assessment, personal development, behaviour and welfare, outcomes for pupils. What does that mean for you as a SENco? Well, what's the evidence that the inspectors are going to be looking for? What we're going to be looking for is evidence of, firstly, I want to see your register. I want to see it up to date, and I want to see it as a working document. So on the register, I want to see pupil name, I want to see pupil age, I want to know their ethnicity, I want to know their date of birth, I want to know what category of special need they have. I want to know what level they are. So do they have an educational health and care plan? Do they have additional needs but no formal diagnosis? Do they have a diagnosis? All these are really important. I also want to know the category, so where do they fit? Is it cognition and learning? Where is it? I want to know. I also want to know what provision is being put in place, what extra provision is being put in place. That's really important. And I would also like to see what their attainment is, where they're at, and whether or not they're making progress. If they're not making progress, I want to see that. I want to see that that is RAG rated, so red, amber, green. If they are making progress, they can be green. If they are making some progress but not really the expected progress, let's have amber. If that child isn't making progress, then we need it in red, and I want to see what interventions are being put in place to support that child. So I need accurate information that's up to date and that is clear. Then I want to see what the pupil attainment is, in particular progress that they make from their starting points. So as your children come in, I want you to look at your milestones, I want you to look at what it is that your expectations are and whether or not the children are meeting them. Now we all know that, some kids will make quick progress, other children won't. It doesn't mean that they've got a special educational need, but it could mean that they are on your radar. So I want that identifying as well. So those pupils who are on your radar. I want to have some baseline assessment. I need to know where those pupils are coming from. That's really important because we can't actually measure progress if we don't know where the starting point is. So let's have a look at our starting points. I want the pupils who are not making adequate progress, less than expected progress, and are unlikely to, on current performance, make the expected progress, I want those to be identified. Again, I would say that in the first term of the new year, there will be pupils that you think, okay, well, I have a concern, they're on my radar, but actually by the end of that term, by the end of that year, they are making progress. Progress for them. It doesn't have to be in line with other children. It has to be in line with what we expect for that child with their baseline. So make sure we have accurate information. Make sure that we are aware of baselines. Let's identify any pupils who are not making the progress that we think. We need to have arrangements in place for those pupils who are not making the progress that we expect. I want to know what you've got in place. It could be that you have a nurture group, for example, going on. It could be that you're in a little social skills group, an extra play area, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But the Ofsted inspector needs to know what's happening. So you would have on your register the name of the child, all their personal details. You would have their milestones and whether or not they're meeting them. If they're not meeting them, I want that to be rag rated so that I can see who's not making progress. And then I'd like to see what is being put in place to make sure that that progress is being made, or that child is getting support. Once you've put intervention in place, and that should really be in-class intervention, because what the Code of Practice does say is that really we don't want pupils being withdrawn particularly. I have mixed feelings about that, because I think some children, they just need to be in a smaller environment, they need a focus. I'm not going to look at provision that withdraws children and say, actually, that's wrong. I don't think that's the right way of moving forward. However, I do need to see that there is some intervention. There is a recognition of need. It's based on factual evidence, and there is something being done about it. And then we need to see regular and accurate monitoring of progress. Okay, it's really interesting to have that it's really important to have that in place, because as with everything, what's the point of doing anything if we don't monitor it? Okay, and particularly with Ofsted. Ofsted isn't scary. It's about, I hate to say it, but it's about jumping through hoops. So let's just make sure that we know what we're doing. Make sure that we accurately and regularly monitor exactly what the pupils are doing. One of the things that often doesn't happen in schools is rigorous moderation of what's happening. So you as the class teacher might say, okay, well, this child's not making the progress that they should be doing. Perhaps in phonic development, say. You think, okay, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to put an intervention in place. I'm going to say that the intervention is working, they're making progress. But actually that needs to be moderated. So within your key stage, within your year group, if you are in a school where there are more than one class, where there's more than one class, where there's more than one teacher, where you have a key stage leader, together with the SENco, I think it's really important that you have moderation of pupil attainment and progress. Okay, it's really important, because that gives you the backup. That gives you a sense of someone working with you, and together, it's always easier, isn't it, together to make a sense of what's going on. Then, I want to see evidence that the gap is narrowing. Okay, so you've got your information, you've got your register, you know who's not making progress, you put in place waves of provision and intervention, you are regularly and accurately monitoring it, you are moderating what you're doing. What else? What else do we need to look at? So in order to narrow the gap, we need to be sure that the arrangements we have in place are effective. There's no point in doing anything if it's not effective. I've seen children be withdrawn for a whole year, and actually the progress that they've made isn't really worth the amount of intervention that they've had. So we need to make sure that the support is effective, and I need to be able to see that gap is narrowing. So we need to have a regular review of the quality of support arrangements, and that has to be directly linked to the pupils' outcomes. Okay, it's all about those outcomes. If you have put in place an intervention and actually when you look at it you think the pupils aren't really making progress, then change it. Don't be afraid to change what you're doing, to modify it. Or it could be that you've got a couple of children in a group who are starting to make really good progress. Take them off the list, move them down a notch, let them go on to your sub what would I call it, sub list, if you wish. Be bold, be willing to change the arrangements that you're offering, and have the courage of your convictions. What we need to see, and this is what the Code of Practice says time and time again, is that we need to see a curriculum that's broad and balanced. How many times have we heard that? And that it meets the needs and interests of the pupils. Okay, that's really important. So it's about knowing the pupils in your class. So again, it's about having that baseline data. Again, it's about offering a curriculum that's meaningful for those students. Because we all know when we have a class, sometimes we have classes that are full of high flyers. Sometimes we have classes that are perhaps not as socially able as others. So it's about knowing the class and tailoring the curriculum accordingly. One of the things that I want to see as an inspector is how you are communicating and linking with parents. That's a really, really important thing. For us to know that you are having that regular dialogue that's above and beyond what the class teacher is having. So if you're a SENco, I want to see evidence of the meetings that you're having with parents of pupils, not just who have education and healthcare plans, because that's almost built in anyway, isn't it, to your review process. But what about those pupils who you have got identified as having needs? I want evidence of the dialogue that's going on between you and the parent. Okay, that's really important. For me, as a SENco, as an SEN specialist, that's what I want to see. I want to see the quality of that relationship that you have with the parent, particularly in foundation and key stage 1. That's really important. It gets more difficult as you go up the key stages because parents become less engaged. But particularly in this stage, it may mean that you have to have difficult conversations with parents at this stage, because you're the one who's identifying need at times. So make sure that you have those dialogues, and I want to see those dialogues, evidence of those dialogues. One of the issues that I think is raised an awful lot is the fact that in the Code of Practice it says that the SENco should be part of the senior leadership team. I wonder how many SENcos are. Well, in my experience, head teachers and senior leaders are sometimes a bit loath to have SENcos on their senior leadership team. I'm not really quite sure why, because it's all about progress, isn't it? And it's about progress of everyone at every level. And of course, it could be that as SENco or as a class teacher that you're also responsible for the gifted and talented, the more able of pupils. I want to see that as well. I want to see what you're doing, who they are, what you've got in place. So the evidence that I would want to see if I came in to inspect is a range of evidence. Okay, so I don't just want your list. I don't just want your register. Okay. I want to see more than that. I want to have a quality dialogue with you, either as the class teacher or as SENco or as a senior leader or as the head teacher. I want to know what's going on in your school, what's going on in your classroom, what's going on in your provision. So in order to make a judgment, then I'll be looking at performance data, I'll be looking at the school's in-year performance data. Okay, so not only am I looking at the end of the year, but I want to see what progress is being made as you're going along. That can be in an electronic form, it can be on a spreadsheet, it can be however you want to present it. That's not the problem, as long as I can see that it's happening. You don't need to go over the top. We don't need extensive collection of work or marks or things like that. That's not needed. But it might be worth putting into your file, either your class file or your SENco file, just a little bit of evidence that shows that you are aware of different levels, for example. But it's not a requirement. Let me just see. So I don't expect that, I've said this already actually, that performance data and pupil tracking information is in a particular format. It doesn't really matter as long as we've got it and as long as we can see that. But it needs to be provided in a way that I can access it, because sometimes I'll go in and I'll have a look and I'll think, oh, I don't know what this means. So it needs to be clear. So try and keep it nice and clear. Try and keep it fairly simple in what you're trying to say. And as I say, rag rate it. If you've got your red, amber and your green, that's just a wonderful way, because it's so visual, we can see it straight away. And you can do that over time. So for example, if you have a child who comes in September, who you think is not working at the level that they should be working, then we can put a red and then we can change it through the year. Okay, David, I've got a question. It says, how do we demonstrate progress for children who are working substantially below and are consistent peers not meeting on the data? Well, you know, if they're not meeting, they're not meeting. But what I want to see is what you're doing. What are you doing to support that? So we need to have intervention. So I want to know what the intervention is. I want to know how that intervention is being monitored. And if it's not working for that child, why isn't it working? Okay, I need to know that it isn't working. That's fine. If it's not working, it's not working. The child's not making progress. But we need to change it, don't we? So as an inspector, what I want to see is a recognition from you that they're not meeting and what you're going to do about it. So you can put something in place. You could, on your spreadsheet, say, you can put that you have got, for example, you have got a small booster group going on phonics, for example. I would expect to see some progress in that child. I would expect that. If you are putting in extra provision and it's not having an impact on progress, it's not the right provision. So I need to see that. You need to make that evident to me. So say, for example, in September, you have the level that they're working at. By the time we get to December, if they've made no progress, let's see what the intervention is. Put an intervention in place. If that isn't working, I need to know why it isn't working. I need to know what you've done to monitor that. And I want to see the adjustments that you're making for that child to ensure that they do make some progress. Now, you can use small step progress. Remember, we don't have to make leaps and bounds. Special needs children don't make leaps and bounds. They make small steps. Evidence, give the evidence that that child's made small steps, because they will have made small steps. They might not be meeting, they might not be meeting as the way other children are, but they will be making some progress. They will be. And if they're not, you need to change the interventions that you're putting in place. Okay. Or you need to have evidence that you're having the discussion with the ed psych, that you're having discussion with the SALT, or whoever it is, whatever the need is. You need to have evidence that that's happening. And if you've got that evidence trail and that child still isn't making progress, you're going to be referring them on anyway, aren't you? You know, they're going to need something extra. So just paint a picture so that when I come in as an inspector, the picture's there. I can see what's happening. I can see that you're aware of what's happening. I can see that you are aware of why it might not be happening and what you're putting in place to help that. I hope that makes sense. So if we go back to what the evidence is, oh sorry, I'll just have a look. Which allows us to track. Sounds like wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've got small steps. That's what we need to see. Because some children, that's all it's going to be, isn't it? It's going to be small steps. So evidence that, you know. And it could be that between September and Christmas, it is so small. You know, the steps that they're making are so small that it's really difficult to measure. But just paint that picture. Let us know that that's what's happening. Because you're doing that anyway as a class teacher or as a SENco. You're doing that anyway, aren't you? Because you're having that dialogue constantly. Is there a risk of moving children between ability groups too much? Would that be frowned upon? Yeah, you wouldn't. I don't think you would move children between ability groups particularly. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's all about quality first teaching, and that quality first teaching, which is stated in the Code of Practice, is about the teacher meeting the needs of every child in the class. However, you know, you still need to be mindful that not all children are at the same level at the same time. So I think, you know, as long as you're not withdrawing them and making them different, if you will, then within a class, I don't think that's a problem, that you can move them from table to table or whatever, as long as you're meeting their needs. And again, it's about making sure that you evidence that and why you're doing it. Okay. So what we need as inspectors is we need as much first-hand evidence as possible. So that's often we get that from observing pupils in lessons, talking about their work, scrutinising their work, seeing what's going on. Because, you know, we've been into schools where a wonderful picture is being painted by the senior leadership team, but when you start unpicking it, actually, well, it can be quite disappointing. For example, you have got a small booster group going on phonics, for example. I would expect to see some progress in that child. I would expect that. If you are putting in extra provision and it's not having an impact on progress, it's not the right provision. So I need to see that. You need to make that evident to me. So say, for example, in September, you have the level that they're working at. By the time we get to December, if they've made no progress, let's see what the intervention is. Put an intervention in place. If that isn't working, I need to know why it isn't working. I need to know what you've done to monitor that. And I want to see the adjustments that you're making for that child to ensure that they do make some progress. Now, you can use small step progress. Remember, we don't have to make leaps and bounds. Special needs children don't make leaps and bounds. They make small steps. Evidence, give the evidence that that child's made small steps, because they will have made small steps. They might not be meeting, they might not be meeting as the way other children are, but they will be making some progress. They will be. And if they're not, you need to change the interventions that you're putting in place. Okay. Or you need to have evidence that you're having the discussion with the ed psych, that you're having discussion with the SALT, or whoever it is, whatever the need is. You need to have evidence that that's happening. And if you've got that evidence trail and that child still isn't making progress, you're going to be referring them on anyway, aren't you? You know, they're going to need something extra. So just paint a picture so that when I come in as an inspector, the picture's there. I can see what's happening. I can see that you're aware of what's happening. I can see that you are aware of why it might not be happening and what you're putting in place to help that. I hope that makes sense. So if we go back to what the evidence is, oh sorry, I'll just have a look. Which allows us to track. Sounds like wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've got small steps. That's what we need to see. Because some children, that's all it's going to be, isn't it? It's going to be small steps. So evidence that, you know. And it could be that between September and Christmas, it is so small. You know, the steps that they're making are so small that it's really difficult to measure. But just paint that picture. Let us know that that's what's happening. Because you're doing that anyway as a class teacher or as a SENco. You're doing that anyway, aren't you? Because you're having that dialogue constantly. Is there a risk of moving children between ability groups too much? Would that be frowned upon? Yeah, you wouldn't. I don't think you would move children between ability groups particularly. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's all about quality first teaching, and that quality first teaching, which is stated in the Code of Practice, is about the teacher meeting the needs of every child in the class. However, you know, you still need to be mindful that not all children are at the same level at the same time. So I think, you know, as long as you're not withdrawing them and making them different, if you will, then within a class, I don't think that's a problem, that you can move them from table to table or whatever, as long as you're meeting their needs. And again, it's about making sure that you evidence that and why you're doing it. Okay. So what we need as inspectors is we need as much first-hand evidence as possible. So that's often we get that from observing pupils in lessons, talking about their work, scrutinising their work, seeing what's going on. Because, you know, we've been into schools where a wonderful picture is being painted by the senior leadership team, but when you start unpicking it, actually, well, it can be quite disappointing, and it's really obvious. Don't try and hide anything. If you think you've got a weakness, if you think, say, for example, the waves of provision that you're offering aren't being particularly effective, don't try and hide that. Tell us that it's not being particularly effective. Tell us why, and tell us what you're doing about it. So you would let us know that, you know what's working. You know what's not working. It doesn't matter if it's not working, as long as you know and you are changing that provision. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. That self-reflection, that self-evaluation is more important than you trying to produce something that makes it look as though all the kids are making wonderful progress, because we know that they're not. Okay, so try and make sure that, you know, you paint a right picture. And you know, I hope that you'd have an inspector who's sympathetic to that. There are quite a few legal requirements through the SEN Code of Practice, and what I've found is that often, if the head teacher isn't the SENco, if you are the SENco or you are involved in teaching children with special needs, you need to make sure that you have those legal requirements in place. It is the responsibility of SLT, along with the SENco, to determine the strategic development of the SEN policy, SEND policy and provision. And if your head teacher is doing that without you as a SENco, then really you need to be having that dialogue. I know that's easier said than done, because I've been in positions where I've been the SENco and I'm saying to the head, well, actually we need to work together on this. And, you know, it depends on your head teacher, and we are aware of that. But you know, you should be having that input. What we do need is we need to have an awareness of trends over 3 years. Now, we're not going to have a look at what's happening with your data and say, oh, well, you know, you haven't got full data over 3 years. One of the arguments that we always have is that teachers will say, but cohorts are different. Well, yes, we know that. But what we're not really looking at the cohorts. What we're doing is we're looking at the provision, and we're looking at how the school manages the provision, how it identifies need and addresses that need. That's more important, and I think that's really why we're looking at trends, to see what's happening, because it gives us a sense of where you're at. Again, that's fine if you've got a stable staffing, if you've got a stable SLT, but you know, lots of schools don't. And we go into schools where, you know, they haven't had a head teacher for a while, or you know, they've had lots of supply teachers, and it is difficult. But try and do the best that you can. Our focus will always be on current progress. Okay, so even if we do look at trends, our real interest is in what's going on in the classroom at that time, looking at starting points and how you are preparing your pupils for the next stage. Okay, always about progress. So would it be a good idea to keep a log of parent dialogue and interaction? Absolutely. It's really, really important that you keep a log. And I know that we work hard at Twinkl to make sure that we've got the necessary paperwork and documentation that you need in place to be able to do that. That's really important. It's like a saying, you know, if we haven't got it written down, it hasn't happened. I know, having worked as both a head teacher and a SENco, that actually, you know, you run ragged, or a class teacher, you know, you run ragged. To then have to make a log is also really quite difficult. So, you know, please look on the Twinkl website, because we do have quite a lot of pro forma to support that. But even if you're just making a little bit of a note, just, you know, have a book, a contact log, that you just write down when you contacted the parent, what it was about, and the outcome. If it's going to be, say for example, an initial discussion with a parent around a need, I would make sure you log it, because what you don't want is the parent to come back to you then and say, well, you didn't tell me this, or I wasn't aware that my child wasn't making progress. So it's really quite important. I'm not going to, as an inspector, look at all your logs. That's not going to happen. But if you've got a folder or a book or something, and you go, and this is what I've been doing, this is what I do, that's what I want to see. I want to see the processes in place. I'm not going to go and have a look and see who you've contacted. I'm not going to ring them up and find out, you know, what was said. But I do want to see that it's happening. It's really crucial, you know, in terms of the SEN code of practice, that we have that going on, and that discussion and dialogue, and you have the evidence. As I say, if I don't see it, it's not happening. I know that, you know, I'm a practitioner. I work in the classroom. I know how difficult it is. But I think if you get into the habit of having these systems in place and doing it as an ongoing thing, then it is easier. One of the things that we will need to see, that I think most schools have now, is your SEN information report. That's really important. And it's defined in the Code of Practice, point 6.79. Okay? I look as though I know what I'm talking about there. I've actually got it written down so that I would remember. It has to be on the website. And if you look at point 6.79, it'll tell you what you need to put in that. So you need to talk about the local offer. You need to talk about what who leads SEN. You need to talk about what provisions put in place. Very challenging. I cannot speak English. To show progress, small though it may be. Depends how you're working with them. So if it depends. Can you tell me, is the child verbal? Can the child speak at all, even if it's not in English, if it's in their home language? Okay, if you just let me know. It doesn't have to be speaking, does it? You know, a child with significant ASD, if they are coming into school, Fluent in Polish. Okay, so he does. So the child does speak. Okay. So you can think of the challenges. You know, not only does the child have ASD, the child doesn't speak English. That's going to be really difficult for them, isn't it? And really difficult for you as a teacher to be able to show that progress. But again, it's about the small steps. It's about you separating the two almost. Okay, if the child can speak, because a lot of children with autism don't speak, they're non-verbal. But if the child does speak, then try and use materials that he can access. So it could be that you need to have, in the first instance, materials that are translated into Polish. I know we have a lot of materials online on the Twinkl site that will help you with that. And the child will be making progress. It's just that they might not be making the progress that you perhaps would expect. But it could be that they're now coming into school without crying. It could be that the child is able to now sit down in assembly. If you can evidence that, so have an evidence sheet, an observation sheet, something like that, where you have the background of the child and you say what their starting point was. So, for example, a child won't come into school. Okay, they're crying, they have separation anxiety, and so on and so forth. You, over a period of time, put in some support mechanisms for that child, so that you have a TA meet them at the door. You have materials that are in Polish, perhaps if the child can read. You have materials that they recognise, and then little by little the child then comes into school. That's progress. Okay, so have a pro forma. I'm not sure if we have one on the Twinkl site, but I'll have a look for you. Where you just make a note of that. You make a note of that, and then on your register, you'll have a comments area, and make a note of it there too. Okay, very small steps. Just, you know, a child who's coming into school who has EAL, who has ASD. Come on, they're going to be making really small steps. So just make sure you evidence. Okay. Thank you. If there's anything else that you'd like to know, if you just message me, that's not a problem, and we can I can answer any questions.